Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bipolar UK World Bipolar Day conference. Really glad that you could join us this evening. My name is Sewell. I'm going to be chairing our panel this evening, and tonight by a distinguished panel of experts, all of whom, including myself, have bipolar. But before we start, we're running a poll tonight in real time, and we're asking what you think, what our audience at Bipolar UK think in our community. And we're asking, do we need men-only services to help men better manage their bipolar? And it's important to us at Bipolar UK to know what you're thinking, and so that will really help us to shape our services and support you as a community as we go forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel this evening. So we have the co-founder of Mindful, James Harrop, with us this evening. Also, mental health policy manager, Jeremy Clark, and NHS psychiatrist, Dr. Nick Pryor. Welcome, gentlemen. Good to see everyone. So, Nick, if I may start with you. As a psychiatrist, you could be careful of our mics this evening as well, please, gentlemen. I know there's quite a little bit of interference right now. Just for the sake of our audience out there, that would be brilliant. So, Nick, starting with you, as a psychiatrist, what do we mean by self-care, and why specifically do you think men with bipolar and self-care needs such a focus?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. Yeah, I mean, as a psychiatrist, I think it's a very important question, because I think, as maybe a lot of people out there today listening will have experienced, it's not really something that the majority of the NHS or psychiatrists as a whole really touch upon. It's seen as something more in the social setting, and there isn't the investment or the time put aside to actually value the elements of self-care that can really help kind of not only get you out of a difficult episode in terms of mood, but also sustain a longer recovery. So yeah, I don't think, I mean, if I look through the whole of my medical training, which has nearly been a whole decade now, I don't think the word self-care has ever come up formally in my education. It's only come about through my own personal experiences with bipolar and actually trying to find a more sustainable, holistic approach to looking after the mind.
It sounds like there's a really big gap then between the medical profession, which of course are our North Star in terms of medication and steering, certainly a big part of it. Why do you think that is that? How is that? Is that a cultural thing, do you think, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big cultural problem with the medical community and the healthcare professional community as a whole. I think there's a kind of a natural, I mean, not of all, there's no blame associated here. It's just that it's kind of a natural consequence of the way in which we're educated and taught to look after other people creates a culture of us and them. And it's very much, it's difficult for, we're taught to almost, certainly as doctors, to be these kind of white knights who can be this kind of emblem of how you should be and how actually we are perfect, which of course we are not. But and therefore it makes it very difficult for a lot of healthcare professionals to actually get down and kind of dirty into the actual realities and the practicalities of what it is like to live with a mental illness. And this means that actually lots of the people who are talking from a medical perspective and not speaking with actually the patients, they're not able to really empathize truly with their patients. And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, it sounds like a complex issue. And I'm sure that many of our audience, be it that it's people that have bipolar themselves, men with bipolar, or their families or friends that are watching our panel this evening, will find that an oxymoron in itself. But let's sort of dive down into, well, what is self-care? What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most of us will agree that, the mind is very complex. We are all individuals, and therefore self-care means very different things for different people. But ultimately, I think if you were to try and define it, it's basically investing energy and resource into yourself and valuing yourself, so that, and I suppose that the cliche, the one liner that everyone always talks about is that you can't give from an empty cup. So it's not only there's actually a a greater gain to not only looking after yourself, but it means that you can also give back more as well.
I'm interested, James, what are your perspectives, your own personal experiences on what does self-care mean to you? I think it might be interesting to illustrate the specifics with maybe what you do to look after yourself.
You're on mute.
On mute, thanks.
Absolutely. Ben, firstly, I just want to say thanks so much for having us here, Bipolar UK, and particularly to the people we're speaking to out there at the moment. From my side of things, we're talking about sort of acceptance of having bipolar, as well as sort of denial of having it. So I'm particularly interested in it. If anyone's listening who might have recently got a diagnosis or might have recently sort of more accepted their diagnosis, and I certainly feel I could empathise with that side of the audience. But in terms of self-care and what that means, from you can only speak from personal experience, really. And probably what I'll talk about a bit is sort of my own diagnoses, but I think fundamentally self-care to me is actually that internal voice in your head. And there's sort of two forms of self-care. There's one whereby you're compassionate to yourself, so that inner voice is being kind to yourself. So self-care to me starts with thought, in a way. And when I have that good relationship with my thoughts, or that kind relationship with myself, I know I'm then in a position to actually take care of myself in the physical world. And I think if we can begin with a kind voice to ourselves, we're then enabled to go and practice various things in the real world to look after ourselves. And I think certainly from a standpoint of bipolar and my own journey and not accepting that, it's very hard to take care of yourself if you're not accepting that you have an illness, or not accepting that actually you can and need to look after yourself. And in not doing that, you can become incredibly isolated, if you like, because you're not willing to take on, all these different methods that you can do to look after yourself. And that's something at Mindful, which, the company I've set up, I've actually set it up with Dr. Nick as well, is something which we really focus on finding these things you can do to look after yourself.
It's amazing, isn't it? The sense of awareness and acceptance is such a huge theme. I talk about acceptance in terms of almost like a solar system, because throughout our lives, we think that we've accepted a part of our illness or something that we need to do. And then you kind of look up at the stars and then you realize, wait, there's so much more that I need to accept. And then you have to go out to another planet and then get to grips with another kind of acceptance with what we do. But I think what and you make some really compelling points, James. Jeremy, as far as your ideas around self-care are, perhaps you could illustrate for us your idea behind this digital toolbox. I know you talk a lot about prevention plans and actions plans, but it's more than that, isn't it? It's about an attitudinal change, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd just like to say great to be here this evening, and thank you to Bipolar UK for the opportunity to speak. I think when it comes to self-care, one of the things we've talked about is diagnosis, and getting your diagnosis, accepting your diagnosis. It took me about 10 years to get a diagnosis, so I like to think of myself as the average guy, because that's pretty consistent with what the commission found. But I didn't have a problem with accepting it once I did get a diagnosis, and then I was able to start that journey of discovery into what is this condition, what are my symptoms, what are my triggers, and how do I plan, how do I manage, and how do I manage my mood. At the time that I got my diagnosis in 2000, the internet was just being born. So there wasn't too much information out there, but I started looking at online forums and came across some tools. And I like to think about toolboxes in general, but the specific point you raised was about digital toolbox. And if our audience are interested, they can go onto the Bipolar UK website, and if you just search for the digital toolbox, you can see a number that I recommend. And one of the ones that I started off with was called Mood Scope, and that just involved every day playing a little game with the online program, and that would give me a mood score, and then I could kind of track my mood over time. Now today, Bipolar UK is launching a new app. So if there are people out there who are just starting to manage a condition, try downloading the app. You can plot in your mood every day. You can see that over time, and that's a really useful thing to take along to a clinician. So I think there are digital tools that can help us. They don't cure you of bipolar, but there are lots of things that we can do to help manage our condition, and that is part of what I would see as being self-care.
And James and Nick, for our audience that might not be familiar with Mindful, your app is focused on mental fitness, which at its core has self-care right at its heart, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of reasons why we're phrasing it as mental fitness, but we think it's the right kind of merging of the mental.
I think we've lost Nick there just for a second. James, whilst Nick's screen is unfreezing, would you like to pick up and help our audiences learn a little bit more about what you do at Mindful and in a self-care context?
Absolutely, and I think Nick's almost posed in a perfect position, because talking about mental fitness, he was going to come on to the fact that what we've been trying to do at Mindful, which is the platform that we've set up, is take the rigor of mental health and the sort of scientific and methodical approach of science of mental health, and combine it with the sort of accessibility and fun of mental wellness, but that might have connotations of being a bit, not necessarily based in science, or almost sort of a bit fluffy, but bringing those two together to create mental fitness and this concept of something which is accessible and fun, as well as sort of grounded in the science. And Nick, you can allude more on the science side of things, but essentially that's sort of the why we're going with mental fitness.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because I think a lot of people who've spent a lot of time trying to understand their own journey, and we become our own experts, but ultimately there's still a lot of people out there who are not getting access to the right care or the right support, and so that's what frustrates me as a doctor within the NHS is that we have actually some very good tools. We have some very good structures, whether it's founded in the biopsychosocial model and then fed through between kind of access to CBT, the right kind of first line, second line medications, and then actually some social prescribing. But in practice, very few people actually engage fully in that arena. And actually, a lot of people don't even get to that point. And so I think we need to be more proactive. We need to go out there and actually engage people in this world in which actually everyone's fighting for our attention, and actually we're getting taken down these wormholes of social media, of Netflix, or whatever it is. And some of these can be good, but actually we need to try and bring good mental health to that kind of caliber of engagement, so that people can actually get the benefits of all this good science and the efficacy behind it all.
So what would you say then, Nick, would be a good first step for men and self-care and their family and friends that might be part of our viewers this evening? So you've really sort of break it down. I think self-care can still be a little bit of an ambiguous term. We've talked about the gap between the medical profession and us with bipolar itself. But in terms of if we say, what is self-care? What can we do as men? What is that first step would you suggest? We've got some good tools. We're talking about Mindful and some of the things that Jeremy's been saying, but let's talk practical steps.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the really important thing, I think, which both James and Jeremy touched on, is that self-care is what it is to the individual. So there are a lot of preconceived conceptions. So I think if I would have thought of self-care kind of 4 or 5 years ago, I'd be thinking of breath work, yoga, having a pedicure, going for a massage. It kind of fits this kind of very stereotypical kind of area that is more generally associated with kind of the gender as in women. So I think what we've got to try and do is actually say, well, one, I'm very happy to engage in that space, and I have quite regular pedicures myself, actually. But ultimately, there are other parts of self-care. So going for a jog after work is a form of self-care. It's basically saying, I do need 20 minutes, half an hour to de-stress on my own before I come home to engage with my family, so that I can be fully present with them when I come home. It's accepting that actually, so for us, a lot of what I do in my work as a as a doctor is trying to give people that sense, or that these acts, these quite often quite mundane daily acts, are actually hugely valuable. So, I mean, Jeremy, when we've chatted once before, but I was so impressed and taken by how structured and how thoughtful he has been about how he needs to kind of in a stepwise way manage his mental health. And I think we can all do that, whether we've got bipolar or not, is my view.
One thing that I wanted to talk about, if you don't mind me coming in here, Ben, and picking up on what Nick was just saying, is when we're thinking about specific self-care for men, I think maybe we need to take a step back first and ask the question, what is different about men in terms of how they experience bipolar? There are some things that are very obvious about the way that women experience bipolar that don't affect men. So, for example, psychosis after having a baby is a risk for some women with bipolar, and in fact that can often be their first episode. Questions around medication during pregnancy, or if you're wanting to get pregnant, are also, you know, another big question. And there are lots of other areas that women are affected, and I think Bipolar UK has been very good in providing webinars and lots of information on that. Dr. Claire Dolman is an expert who speaks often. So what's different for men? And I think we need to look at things like how men perceive themselves in society. So we're very much still brought up with the social role of being a provider or a protector. We know that, you know, everyone with bipolar can be affected by loss of employment and difficulties at work. But there's research to suggest that can particularly affect men. It affects both men and women, but men seem to suffer more from that loss of status, employment, and how that affects the identity of being a provider, perhaps. So one thing that I think is really important is how you find meaning in your life. So if you are struggling at work, how can you get back into work, or what can you do instead? So when I was going through problems, you know, volunteering for a charity was something that gave me meaning, gave me a sense of purpose, and gave me a sense of self. So even if I was at a party or something like that and I didn't have a job to talk about, at least I could say, well, you know, this is what I'm doing. And you know, for other people, it'll be doing something creative, you know, being an artist or a musician, or it might be that you decide, okay, I'm off work, I'm really going to get fit. So that's one thing I think is finding meaning and purpose to cope with that particular specific issue to men. The other thing that I think is important that links in with that is having variety. So if you lose one of those things, there's something else that you can amplify. Or there's sort of 2 or 3 things that you can fall back on. So, you know, if I focus 100% on my job and I lose it, that's going to be traumatic. But if I've got lots of different things, then there are other things that I can pick up, and I'm not going to feel quite so catastrophic about it. And so that's why I'm quite interested in Mindful and the sort of different activities, and I think it ties in there maybe.
Yeah, I think James, or what I was going to say, but I wanted to butt in there, just say, yeah, I think that what you've touched upon there is this needing to have kind of basically safeguards, or you know, the idea of having things in place so that if when one thing does get taken away, the stack of cards doesn't fall away. And I think that's you know, these are generalizations that I'm making, but as a population as a whole, men are more likely to be more black and white in their thinking. They're more likely to be obsessive and to have that one single thing in their life. And this is besides bipolar diagnoses. So I think it's that overlap of a bipolar diagnosis and that kind of those traits of personality that probably mean that there's more risk there for men. I think then one other point before I'm working on a mother and baby unit at the moment, so a mental health mother and baby unit. So, and it has really dawned on me how fortunate I am not to have gone through considerations about changing my medication when you're going through a pregnancy. And what's really interesting is that even from my mother has bipolar as well, and from her generation, they've started to realize much more this kind of risk benefit ratio. And actually, we, as I'm sure some people, we have very little evidence to support the use of hardly any kind of medication in kind of pregnant groups and young children and babies and stuff. So it's always been a bit of an unknown, but through gradually piecing together case studies and whatever, we've started to realize the risks for a lot of these kind of mood stabilizing drugs, lithium being the obvious one recently, where now actually if someone's got a very clear diagnosis of bipolar and they're very responsive to medication, we would always advise that they stayed on lithium throughout the pregnancy. Whereas in my mother's generation, she was advised to go off it, and sunk into a huge depression after my twin sister and I were born. So it is very important, I think, the distinctions you were raising, Jeremy. Yeah.
Just one thing I want to add to that, Ben, just when we're sort of defining what self-care and men, I find that often with bipolar and men are probably sort of forced into self-care, if you like. So we didn't realize that we needed it, if you like, and because of our illnesses and because of sort of the psychoses or the mania, or from my side of things, you're like, okay, fine, I'm forced into this, and as a result, I'm slightly on a different path to my mates and stuff, and actually I'm way more open about doing breath work, about doing yoga. I was doing yoga and breath work years ago before any friends were, and I think that situation we find ourselves in, we begin our self-care journey, if you like, and I think it is a journey. And Nick and I we were discussing this earlier today in a mindful workshop. Self-care is a journey in that things come in and out of your life of ways in which you can look after yourself. And what's great is as you go through life, you find more and more things that you can do in order to look after yourself, in order to continue with decent self-care. And of course, that's what we're trying to offer at Mindful, is those things that you can do to look after yourself. But yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it, gentlemen? I mean, we're coming back to what we're talking about here. There's many barriers for men specifically on conceptualizing what self-care means to them. We touched on some subjects, the stereotyping and alphaism and the socialization of men, and there are distinct differences between men and women in many contexts. Nick, you raised some interesting points in terms of pregnancy in women as well, and the challenges that faces. And I think it brings us on to an interesting part in this conversation. Living with bipolar takes practice, doesn't it? It's trial and error. It takes time. We have many failures. We have many successes. It's just the nature of living with the disorder, and it teaches a lot of patience and frustration. And if we think in terms of self-care, and then designing and applying a kind of smart and healthy self-care regime, it doesn't just benefit us. So we've been talking about women as well. It benefits our girlfriends, our wives, our brothers, our sisters, our mums. We don't live in a vacuum. And so self-care as a premise is a way of us creating a system through trial and error and experimentation of understanding what works and what doesn't work, to help us with control of ourselves and being able to fall back on whatever action plans that we have in place that we know work or don't work. And of course, we get it right sometimes and we don't get it right other times. From my perspective, I use the self-care model, which I call the spokes. And this is a way of kind of empowering and architecting a life with bipolar without being sort of weighed down by our limitations. And again, this has just been a try. Now, I often get it wrong as well, but as a kind of structure, the idea behind the spokes is, picture yourself riding a bike with two wheels. And of course, the spokes support the wheels so you can get to A to B to your destination. And helping with my own lifestyle design, which Again, I've tried many times and got it wrong many times, but fundamentally around this idea of the spokes is about fulfilling your potential and your opportunity as individuals, as men with bipolar, and obviously this applies to women as well. But if you think of a bike moving, in terms of, let's get practical about what self-care could look like, perhaps for some people, if you think of how spokes on a wheel needs to move around, and looking at each of those spokes individually as an area of focus to help with self-care, to get to our destination from A to B. And then each of these spokes needs a little bit more attention from time to time. Nick, you've mentioned a few things in terms of yoga, meditation, massage. You mentioned pedicure as well, which I think is great. But for me, with these 10 spokes that I use, that has been very, very supportive of my journey, continue to practice, include psychiatry, of course, medication, of course, meditation, yoga, a nutritious diet, physical fitness, connection with the world and creativity and music and arts and interpersonal relationships and acceptance, really gelling all of that stuff together. What I think is something that could be quite interesting for our audience to take away today is this idea of staying focused on our self-care plan. Jeremy, you made some really interesting points, and you, of course, as well, James, in terms of what this structure could look like when things don't go exactly according to plan, but not keeping our eye off the ball when we are feeling good. That's the key, because often when we're feeling great, that stuff goes out the window and you think everything's fine. And then the spokes fall off, your wheel falls off your bike, and you don't get to the destination that you're looking to get to on a daily basis with our lives. So one of the things that I find really helpful, and I'm sure that in your clinical practice, Nick, you come across this, and perhaps Jeremy, you do as well, is this idea of staying focused on our end goal, on our destination of what we'd like our lifestyle design to be about, and fundamentally articulating that by writing it down on a daily basis, and keeping focused on that. And I just wanted to raise a quick point. I recently watched a great TED Talk with this guy called Asaya Hankel, and he talked about the study from Virginia Tech. TED's a great resource for inspiration. And what he was saying is that to keep focus on your goal, your self-care regime, by thinking that you've already achieved it. So let's be realistic about it. There's dark times and there's good times, and living with bipolar is a very complex thing, no doubt whatsoever. But staying focused and visualizing to yourself that you've actually achieved this self-care actually shows a huge amount of benefits. And Nick, you're probably aware of this as well, but through this study, it found that your brain creates an extra sense of awareness with writing stuff down, staying focused on self-care plan on a daily basis by activating a part of the brain called the reticular activity system, which is a really good thing for self-care. It helps us kind of focus. And what the study found was that by visualizing where you want to be with your self-care in this instant, you're at 33% more likely to achieve your goal. So just think about that for a second to help stay focused, write stuff down that's important to you. And in my kind of illustration of these spokes of a lifestyle design of staying really focused, especially when things are really good. Gentlemen, what kind of works for you as we kind of expand this idea? I'm mindful that we've only got a few more minutes left of this conversation, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this.
I'd like to just expand a little bit on one point that you made there, Ben. I really like your metaphor of the spokes on the bicycle. But you said we need to sort of think about what happens when the spokes come off and things start to go wrong. And what I think is really important is to have an action plan. And actually with bipolar, I think you need two. You need one action plan if you're falling off the bike towards mania, and you need another action plan if you're wobbling in the direction of depression. And so you were also talking about monitoring yourself when things are okay. So I think when you start to spot those early warning signs, the sleeplessness, the restless thoughts, the quick thinking, what do you do to stop mania? Well, in my case, it's don't drink alcohol, don't drink caffeine, reprioritize so that I'm not doing too much, don't take any new commitments on, if I'm waking up in the middle of the night, just try and rest rather than walking across London. And I take some medication, which I've agreed with my psychiatrist I take if I'm starting to go manic. And then on the depressive side, sort of similar things, but actually there, it's really important to do quite vigorous exercise to get the mood up. Alcohol's a depressant, so avoiding that's obviously a good idea. And telling people around me as well. So telling my wife, telling my work, where I have been open about it, and I understand why some people wouldn't want to, but I've made that choice. So yeah, I think it's good to have action plans so that when you hit those bumps on the cobbled pathway on your bicycle, you're ready to prevent that. And although you're talking about an end goal, I would say that the goal is staying within a set of parameters so that you're not going too high or too low.
Yeah, and just leading on from that, Jeremy, I think the action plan is absolutely essential, but the sooner you can implement that action plan, the better. And I think that's another thing, we're trying to emphasize today, kind of what it's like to live with bipolar as a man. And I think there is this, we aren't able, or we find it more difficult to be vulnerable. There's been a lot of talk recently, specifically from Brené Brown, another wonderful TEDx talk, by the way, or no, TED talk, about the power of vulnerability. And that really enables us to communicate kind of when we are struggling. And this kind of male alpha, whatever you want to call it, thing of not wanting to ask for help, feeling like you've got to do it on your own and you're bottling it all up. What that means is that you don't implement that action plan, or you probably don't even get to the point of even thinking of implementing an action plan. And that's when you start getting much worse outcomes. And I think with that in mind, what we'll see with most people with bipolar, as Jeremy was saying, I think it's a 9-10 year average until you get a diagnosis. It's an incredibly complex, difficult illness. It's so insidious. It's to do with your mood. It's who you are. How do you separate it from yourself? It's so difficult. And I think it's the big dawning moment of maybe after 5 or 6 years where you've been up and down, lost a few jobs, lost a few relationships. And suddenly you realize that actually, and this is what I think James was talking about earlier, there is this longer term goal. Like, actually, I do want to have some security and some progress and some structure to my life. I do want to have a loving family, perhaps, or I do want to hold down a successful job. Whatever it might be, it's when you look at the longer term outcomes and then apply that to your actual small step-by-step changes. That's when you get really motivated. And actually, on a broader point, that's what we've seen a lot with what's called the kind of third wave of CBT. So it's saying, yes, these kind of SMART goals, these very behavior orientated direct changes are important, but outcomes are so much better if you can say, well, if you can connect those small changes to a long-term goal, like being a good father, like holding down a career. And I think that's a really important step that people with bipolar take. And when they recognize that, that's when you start seeing really kind of quite big change often.
Significant stuff, Nick. Thanks for that. The idea of the power of vulnerability, I think, right at the core of anybody with bipolar is can be quite a fearful thing to face, but actually a magnificent place as well to look through. Because through vulnerability is strength, no matter how we're made as men, no matter how we're made. James, something for you to think about as well. I'd love you to come in here. The idea of making potential happen. It's possible, isn't it?
Say again, the idea for making
potential happen, your own potential happen. It's possible, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think yeah, and in fact, actually, in a way, again, I go back to acceptance, because for so long I sort of denied this illness, if you like, and I just had no association with it, even though I was taking pills every day. I just was, because I tend to just go up. When you go up, you often think you know more than other people, and so you don't sort of associate yourself with that illness. But in terms of achieving one's potential, for example, once I started to accept that illness, I could make I could give myself that sort of space in order to begin to achieve some form of potential within myself. And actually, I think I was talking to a friend who, it's a weird sort of thing, but he might be like 2 or 3 years behind me on his bipolar journey, in terms of, I spoke to him 2 or 3 years ago, and he was still in denial, and he was still trying to say, oh, XYZ caused it and all this sort of stuff. And I was quite frank with him. I said, look, you've got to accept you have an illness, and that's no bad thing. That's a great thing if you can manage it, because obviously you've got the sort of experience of going up and down. And I think I spoke to him recently, and he's sort of come to terms with that and started to accept his illness. And as a result, he is now beginning to achieve his potential, if you like. And I think if you work with your diagnosis and actually use it to your favor, then suddenly, you find yourself here talking to Bipolar UK. It's something I never would have thought of 5 years ago, because I just didn't have that association. So yeah, I do think by looking after yourself, you can begin to fulfill that potential.
Hats off, James. Really compelling stuff. And it's almost like, in that sense of ownership equals potential equals self-care equals living well with what we're doing with bipolar. Gentlemen, we've only got another couple of minutes before we have to wrap up. So what I'd like to do in conclusion today, before I disclose the results of our poll, is, I think that we can all agree that there's not a panacea for men with self-care. But as we've discussed today, I'd really like to invite you both, just in one kind of sentence, to sort of wrap up your ideas for our viewers. And what I mean by ideas is, we've discussed a lot of great stuff today. Something that they can take away and perhaps like to try themselves. Jeremy, if you'd like to start.
Well, at the start of this conference, Simon, actually it was Leah, invited us to put words into that word cloud. One word to sum up self-management, and for me the word is planning. It's about thinking about risk and how do we mitigate it in future, have things in place so if things start to go wrong, we stay on our bicycle.
Like it. Thanks very much, Jeremy. James.
I would say, in this like hyper-connected world where there's so much stimulation, such an easy step towards self-care is, ironically, what I did last week: turn off the phone and just get into nature and just be absorbed by trees and greenery and water, rather than the trillions of colors that are going on in front of us now. So a very simple step away from the screen.
And Nick, your thoughts?
Yes, I think it stems from this line which Charlie McCasey beautifully used quite recently, and it's basically, there's this story between a mole, a horse, and a fox or something. I can't remember exactly, but they talk to each other and they tell themselves wise little sayings and so. And one of my favorites is, that asking for help is one of the bravest things you can do. And I think it's making this connection that help isn't a weakness. And I think this resonates with men in particular. And what that means practically is, if you're there listening right now and you haven't managed to open up to one of your loved ones, and you haven't been able to, because how can they help you if they don't know what the problem is? So for me, accountability and opening up with my wife and with my loved ones is a huge part of how I manage my bipolar. So that's my kind of general thing: open up with the people you most love.
Beautifully and eloquently put, gentlemen. I would say that it's about keeping your spokes moving in a nurturing way. Write it down every day, how your self-care, what your self-care looks like. We've talked a lot about hope, ownership, planning, belief, ownership as well. But I think, as well as it's important to be aware of our limitations, men with bipolar, I think it's also about embracing your opportunity with what we're talking about today. So just to connect with our tech guys, if you could show us the results of our poll right now. I think we've got the final data in. So we asked, do men need men-only services such as support groups? And there's an overwhelming yes, with just over half of our viewers agreeing yes. I'm assuming that's men at the forefront that are doing that. And I personally think that would be a great provision for Bipolar UK to do. No is at 22%, and a few people unsure. I'm sure that the more that we kind of connect together as men and are vulnerable, recognize the power of vulnerability, think about self-belief, think about how we plan for our self-care, we're all going to be living with bipolar in a much more successful fashion. Thanks to my panel, Dr. Nick Pryor, Jeremy Clark, and James Harrop. It's been a pleasure, gentlemen. And we'll be connecting back to the rest of the conference. And stay tuned for Kay Redfield Johnson, a mighty speaker, one of the most influential people within the bipolar community. I urge you to watch that. That's coming up at 8 o'clock. Thanks again to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.